The distant howl of a wolf echoed across the vast prairie as Clara Zimmerman clutched her tattered shawl tightly around her shoulders, the last memento of a life that no longer existed. The coach had left her at this desolate outpost with nothing but a small valise and shattered dreams, miles from anywhere she might call home in the Montana Territory of 1878. The small trading post of Silverstone was hardly more than a collection of weathered buildings, standing defiant against the endless grasslands. Clara's boots, once fine leather now worn thin, kicked up dust as she made her way toward the only establishment showing signs of life, a saloon with piano music spilling from its swinging doors. She hesitated at the entrance. Proper ladies didn't frequent saloons, but proper ladies also didn't find themselves abandoned and penniless in frontier towns. The letter in her pocket, now crumpled from constant handling, contained the final rejection from her fiancé's family. They would not acknowledge her, not after Joseph had died of fever before their wedding day. His parents had made it abundantly clear Clara had no claim to their name or fortune. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the doors. The piano fell silent as heads turned toward her. Clara stood straight-backed despite her exhaustion, refusing to show weakness. "I'm looking for work," she announced to no one in particular, her voice steadier than she felt. A burly man behind the bar eyed her skeptically. "This ain't no place for a lady seeking respectable employment." "I can cook, clean, so I can keep accounts," Clara replied, desperation creeping into her voice despite her efforts. "I can work." The saloon patrons had returned to their drinks, interest in the newcomer already waning. All except one man seated alone at a corner table, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes, keen and assessing, followed her movements. "Nothing here for you," the bartender said dismissively. "Nearest proper town's 40 miles east. Stage won't be back through for a week." Clara's shoulders slumped slightly. A week. She had enough money for perhaps 2 nights at whatever passed for lodging in this place. After that, she turned to leave, fatigue and hunger making her light-headed. As she reached the door, a deep voice stopped her. "Miss." The man from the corner table stood now, tall and broad-shouldered in a worn leather vest. His face was weathered by sun and wind, a short beard covering a strong jaw. He wasn't young, perhaps 35, but moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to physical labor. "Garrett Donovan," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "I've got a small ranch about 3 miles from here. Need someone to help with household matters while I'm working the land." Clara studied him warily. She'd heard stories of women lured into worse situations by such offers. "It's a spare room with its own door," he added, seeming to read her thoughts. "Pays fair, food and board included." The bartender snorted. "Donovan, your place is hardly fit for a woman, half-built as it is." "It's got a roof," Garrett replied evenly, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "Better than no roof at all." Clara weighed her options, which were painfully few. "Mr. Donovan, I appreciate the offer, but I hardly know you." "You can ask around," he replied. "I've been in these parts 5 years now, not much to tell, but nothing that would worry a lady either." She glanced around the saloon, noting the absence of challenge to his claim. Even the skeptical bartender had returned to wiping glasses. "I'll show you the place," Garrett continued. "If it's not to your liking, I'll bring you right back, no obligation." Clara's stomach growled audibly and a flush crept up her neck. She hadn't eaten since the previous day. "Let me buy you supper first," Garrett said, gesturing toward a table. "You can decide after you've eaten." The simple kindness nearly undid her composure. "Thank you," she managed, following him to the table. Over a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread, Clara learned that Garrett Donovan had come west after the war between the states, looking for a fresh start. He'd worked cattle drives and as a ranch hand before staking his own claim 3 years prior. "It's not much yet," he admitted. "Just starting to see some return on the cattle, been more focused on shelter than comfort." Clara nodded, carefully eating the last of her stew. "I should be honest, Mr. Donovan. I came west to marry, but my fiancé died before I arrived, his family." She swallowed hard. "They made it clear I have no place with them." "Sorry for your loss," he said simply. I have nowhere to go, she whispered, the truth of it hitting her anew. But I'm a hard worker. I won't be a burden. Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. We'll figure it out, he said, rising from the table. My wagon's outside if you're ready to see the place. An hour later, as the setting sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Clara saw her new home for the first time. Garrett Donovan hadn't exaggerated. The ranch house was indeed half-built. One section stood complete with a solid roof and walls, while the other remained skeletal, wooden beams outlining rooms that didn't yet exist. Storm last winter damaged what I'd started, he explained, helping her down from the wagon. Haven't had time to finish with the spring calving and fence repairs. Clara surveyed the property. Beyond the house stood a small but sturdy barn, a corral, and the beginnings of what might someday be a garden. The land stretched away in all directions, wildflowers nodding in the evening breeze. Your room's here, Garrett said, leading her to the completed portion of the house. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that faced east. Door has a lock, he added, demonstrating the sliding bolt. My quarters are across the main room. Clara set her valise on the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. Mr. Donovan, Garrett, he corrected. Out here, formality seems unnecessary. Garrett, she tried again. I'm grateful, truly, but I don't understand why you'd offer help to a complete stranger. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Everyone deserves a chance, he finally said. I got mine when I needed it most. In the fading light, Clara could see scars on his hands' burns, perhaps, and wondered what history had brought this solitary man to this remote place. I'll show you the rest in the morning, he said. Kitchen's basic but functional, water pumps just outside. I rise at dawn, but you can rest as long as you need after your journey. After he left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. She had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. For now, at least, she had a roof over her head and the promise of honest work. Sleep claimed her quickly that night, the exhaustion of her journey coupled with the relief of temporary sanctuary. Her dreams were a jumble of faces: Joseph, his disapproving parents, and now the weathered countenance of Garrett Donovan, a stranger who had offered help when she needed it most. Dawn brought the sounds of live cattle lowing in the distance, birds greeting the new day, and the soft clink of metal from the kitchen. Clara dressed quickly in her second-best dress, determined to earn her keep from the first day. She found Garrett at the cast-iron stove, frying bacon in a large skillet. He nodded a greeting, seeming unsurprised at her early appearance. Coffee's hot, he said, gesturing toward a pot on the back of the stove. Cups in that cupboard. The kitchen was simple but orderly. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Open shelves held a modest collection of dishes and cooking implements. A door at the back led to what appeared to be a pantry. I usually take breakfast and dinner here, Garrett explained as they ate. Midday meal I carry with me, depending on where I'm working. Clara nodded, noting the practical arrangement. What would you have me do first? Whatever you think needs doing, he said. You're not a servant, Clara. Consider yourself a partner in managing this place. The word partner startled her, but surely you have specific tasks in mind. Garrett considered this as he finished his coffee. House needs attention, that's certain. Garden could use planting if you're inclined that way. Beyond that, I leave it to your judgment. After breakfast, Garrett showed her the rest of the property, the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance, the 3 horses in the corral, the creek that provided water year-round. He pointed out the boundaries of his land, marked by a creek to the east and a stand of cottonwoods to the west. It's beautiful, Clara said honestly, taking in the rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers. It can be harsh, Garrett warned. Winters are brutal, summers bring drought and sometimes fire, spring brings flooding, but there's a freedom here you won't find elsewhere. As he prepared to ride out to check on his cattle, Clara asked the question that had been on her mind since the previous evening. Why did you really help me, Mr. Donovan? Garrett? The truth, please. He paused, one foot in the stirrup. Everyone in that saloon saw a woman in trouble. I was the only one without a reason not to help. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Clara to ponder his cryptic response. The days fell into a rhythm as April gave way to May. Clara rose with the sun, prepared breakfast, and spent her days transforming the rough ranch house into something that more closely resembled a home. She scrubbed floors, mended curtains fashioned from flour sacks, and organized the sparse furnishings to create a sense of order. Garrett was gone from dawn until dusk most days, returning tired but satisfied with the progress of his small herd. He spoke little of himself, Clara noticed, deflecting personal questions with general observations about the weather or cattle prices. "You never mention family," she ventured one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in magnificent hues. "Don't have any to mention," he replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. Clara respected his reticence, recognizing in it a reflection of her own reluctance to dwell on the past. Instead, she focused on the present, on the small improvements she could make to their daily lives. She planted a garden, coaxing seeds into sprouts with careful tending. She repurposed discarded items into useful household goods. An old barrel became a rain catch for her garden. Worn shirts were transformed into quilting squares for the coming winter. One Saturday morning in early June, Clara was hanging laundry when Garrett approached with an unusual request. "Need to go into town for supplies," he said. "Thought you might want to come along, get anything you need." Clara realized she hadn't left the ranch since her arrival nearly 2 months earlier. "I'd like that," she agreed, suddenly aware of her isolation. The trip to Silverstone revealed how much had changed in Clara's perception. What had seemed a desolate outpost now appeared a bustling hub of civilization compared to life on the ranch. She purchased thread, fabric, and a few personal items while Garrett attended to his business. At the general store, Clara overheard whispered comments that made her cheeks flush. "That's Donovan's woman," one woman murmured to another. "Living out there alone with him all this time? Scandalous," the other replied, "though I suppose beggars can't be choosers." Clara straightened her shoulders and faced them directly. "Good morning, ladies. I'm Clara Zimmerman, Mr. Donovan's housekeeper. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." The women had the grace to look embarrassed at being caught gossiping. They introduced themselves as Mrs. Porter and Mrs. Jenkins, wives of the town's banker and blacksmith, respectively. "We meant no offense, Miss Zimmerman," Mrs. Porter said stiffly. "It's simply unusual for unmarried people to share accommodations in these parts." "I understand your concern," Clara replied evenly. "But necessity sometimes overrides convention. Mr. Donovan has been a perfect gentleman and employer." As they left the store, Clara noticed Garrett waiting outside, his expression suggesting he'd overheard at least part of the exchange. "Town talk doesn't matter much when you're miles away from it," he said as they loaded their purchases into the wagon. "It shouldn't matter at all," Clara replied, irritated by the encounter. "What business is it of theirs how people live their lives?" Garrett's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Most folks out here have little entertainment besides speculating on their neighbors' affairs." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Clara felt a surprising sense of homecoming. In just 2 months, this half-built house on the prairie had become more home to her than anywhere she'd been since leaving her parents' house in Pennsylvania. "I've been thinking," Garrett said suddenly, breaking the silence, "about the unfinished part of the house." Clara glanced at him, curious about his serious tone. "I'm going to finish building it," he continued, "proper-like, with your help designing it if you're willing." "Of course," Clara agreed, surprised by the offer. "But why now?" Garrett's hands tightened on the reins. "Those women in town weren't entirely wrong. Your reputation matters, Clara. A finished house with proper separate quarters would silence some of the talk." Clara felt a pang of something like disappointment, though she couldn't explain why. "You needn't concern yourself with town gossip on my account." "It's not just that," he admitted after a moment. "Place should be finished, been putting it off too long." The next day, Garrett began examining the unfinished portion of the house, assessing what materials would be needed. Clara found herself drawn to the planning, suggesting practical improvements to the original design. "If you move this wall out 3 feet," she demonstrated with a stick in the dirt, "you'd have space for a proper dining room." Garrett considered the modified layout. "Makes sense. What about upstairs?" 2 bedrooms, Clara suggested, "for future needs." Their eyes met briefly before both looked away. The unspoken acknowledgement hung between them. Clara's position was temporary. Eventually, Garrett would likely marry, start a family. She was merely helping prepare the home for that eventual reality. The work began in earnest the following week. Garrett rode to town for lumber and supplies, returning with a wagon loaded to capacity. Each morning, he worked on the construction for several hours before tending to his ranch duties. Clara continued her household tasks while adding the preparation of building materials to her responsibilities. As June turned to July, the skeletal framework took solid form. Walls rose where once there had been only supporting beams. Clara watched with satisfaction as the house expanded, growing from a rudimentary shelter into a proper home. One evening, as they sat on the porch enjoying the cooler air after a scorching day, Garrett surprised Clara with a question. "Your fiancé," he began hesitantly. "What was he like?" Clara's hands stilled in her lap. She rarely spoke of Joseph, finding the memories too painful. But something about the peaceful evening and Garrett's genuine interest loosened her tongue. "Kind," she said after a moment. "Thoughtful. He was a doctor or training to be one when the fever took him. We grew up in the same town, knew each other most of our lives." Garrett nodded, his face half illuminated by the setting sun. "You loved him." "I did," Clara agreed. "But now I sometimes wonder if I loved the idea of him more than the man himself. We were so young when we decided to marry." The admission surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Garrett. It was the first time she'd allowed herself to question the foundation of her grief. "What about you?" she asked, turning the conversation away from herself. "You've never mentioned anyone special in your past." Garrett was silent for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "There was someone once, during the war. She married someone else while I was fighting." His hand unconsciously moved to his left shoulder, where Clara had noticed he sometimes carried tension after long days of work. Probably for the best. Clara sensed there was more to the story, but respected his reticence. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, the vast prairie sky revealing its treasure of stars. In that moment, Clara realized how comfortable she had become in this man's presence. Garrett Donovan was unlike anyone she had ever known, straightforward, hardworking, and possessing an innate dignity that had nothing to do with social standing or education. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because she had found sanctuary when she needed it most, unsettling because she knew it couldn't last. Eventually, she would need to make her own way in the world. The next morning, Clara was kneading bread dough when Garrett entered the kitchen, his expression troubled. "Riders coming," he said, moving to the rifle mounted above the door. "Stay inside." Clara wiped her hands on her apron, alarmed by his reaction. "Who is it?" "Cattle rustlers hit the Morrison place last week," he explained, checking that the rifle was loaded. "Been reports of a gang working their way through the territory." Heart pounding, Clara moved to the window. 3 riders approached at an unhurried pace, still distant enough that their features were indistinguishable. "They don't look to be in any hurry," she observed. Garrett joined her at the window, rifle held ready but not raised. "No," he agreed after a moment, "and rustlers usually hit at night." As the riders drew closer, Clara could make out their features. The leader was a tall man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. Behind him rode a younger man and a woman, both dressed for the trail. "It's Sheriff Hayes," Garrett said, the tension leaving his shoulders. He placed the rifle back on its pegs and stepped onto the porch to greet the visitors. Clara remained in the doorway, watching as the sheriff dismounted and shook Garrett's hand. "Donovan," the sheriff greeted him. "Sorry to trouble you, but we're tracking a group that robbed the stage 2 days back. Thought you might have seen something." Garrett shook his head. Been here the whole time. Haven't noticed any strangers passing through. The sheriff nodded, unsurprised. Figured as much, but had to ask. This here's Daniel Cooper, new deputy. He indicated the younger man. And Miss Sarah Williams from back east. She was on the stage when it was robbed. The young woman looked exhausted, her fine traveling clothes dusty from the trail. Clara stepped forward immediately. "Please, come in," she offered. "I have fresh coffee and bread about to go into the oven." The sheriff looked surprised at Clara's presence, but accepted the invitation with a nod of thanks. Inside, as the visitors refreshed themselves, Clara learned that Miss Williams had been traveling to meet her uncle in Helena when the stage was robbed. The thieves had taken everything of value, including the strongbox and passengers' personal items. "My uncle doesn't even know what happened," Sarah explained, gratefully accepting a cup of coffee. "I was supposed to arrive yesterday." "We'll get you there, miss," the sheriff assured her. "Just need to make sure those men don't hit anyone else along the way." As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Hayes pulled Garrett aside for a private word. Clara couldn't hear what was said, but Garrett's expression grew serious as he nodded in agreement. After the visitors departed, Garrett explained the situation. "Hayes thinks the robbers might be hiding in the hills to the north. Asked me to keep watch and send word if I notice anything suspicious." "Do you think there's danger?" Clara asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Garrett considered this. "Not likely. Robbers usually avoid occupied homesteads, prefer isolated travelers, but will be cautious just the same." That evening, as Clara prepared dinner, she found herself jumping at small noises, the creak of the roof settling, the distant howl of a coyote. Garrett noticed her nervousness and tried to reassure her. "Hayes is good at his job," he said as they ate. "He'll find those men before they cause any more trouble." Clara nodded, embarrassed by her skittishness. "It's silly of me to be frightened. I felt so safe here, I'd almost forgotten what the world outside is like." Garrett's expression softened. "Not silly at all. Being cautious is what keeps folks alive out here." That night, Clara found sleep elusive. She lay awake listening to the symphony of prairie sounds, wind rustling through grass, the occasional lowing of cattle, the hoot of a distant owl. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were troubled by faceless men on horseback, pursuing her across endless plains. She woke to the sound of hammering. Disoriented, she sat up to find sunlight streaming through her window. She had overslept, something she hadn't done since arriving at the ranch. Dressing quickly, Clara found Garrett already at work on the new section of the house, driving nails into the framework of what would become the dining room wall. She noticed he had positioned himself with a clear view of the surrounding prairie, his rifle propped against a nearby post. "I should have started breakfast," Clara apologized, approaching him with a cup of coffee she'd hastily brewed. Garrett accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "You needed the rest, been working hard these past weeks." Clara watched as he returned to his task, the muscles in his back and shoulders flexing with each swing of the hammer. She had grown accustomed to his physical presence, the quiet strength he carried without ostentation. "I'll help you after breakfast," she decided. "4 hands will make the work go faster than 2. Garrett looked as though he might object, then nodded. "Could use the help with holding boards in place while I nail them." Throughout the morning, they worked side by side, establishing a rhythm that required few words. Clara held lumber steady while Garrett secured it, then moved on to the next section. By midday, the outer wall was complete, and they paused to rest in the shade of the porch. "You're good at this," Garrett observed, passing Clara the water dipper. "Most women I've known wouldn't know which end of a hammer to hold." Clara smiled at the compliment. "My father was a carpenter. I used to help him in his shop when my mother wasn't looking." Her smile faded. She thought it unladylike. "Your mother sounds like she had definite ideas about proper behavior," Garrett commented. "She did," Clara agreed. "She would be horrified to see me now, covered in sawdust and wearing a borrowed shirt over my dress." Garrett studied her for a moment. "Are you horrified, I mean?" Clara considered the question seriously. "No," she finally answered. "I find I rather like being useful in ways that go beyond needlework and piano playing." A ghost of a smile crossed Garrett's face. Seems to me usefulness trumps propriety out here most days. As July progressed, the house transformation continued at a steady pace. The outer walls were completed, a new roof raised over the addition, and windows installed to catch the prairie breezes. Clara found herself increasingly invested in the project, suggesting practical touches that would make the house more comfortable and efficient. If we put shelves here, she indicated a wall in what would become the dining room, it could serve as a place to display dishes and store linens. Garrett nodded, making a note of her suggestion. He had begun to defer to her judgment on matters of the house's interior, recognizing her natural talent for creating order and comfort from raw materials. One evening, as a violent thunderstorm lashed the prairie, they sat by the fireplace reviewing their progress. Rain drummed against the roof, occasional lightning illuminating the room in stark flashes. "Should be able to finish the main floor before harvest," Garrett said, studying the rough sketches they had made. "Upper rooms might have to wait until winter when there's less outdoor work to be done," Clara nodded, aware that the ranch duties always took precedence. The cattle and horses needed tending regardless of other projects. "I've been thinking," she said hesitantly, "about what comes next." Garrett looked up, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Next, after the house is finished," Clara clarified. "I came here as your housekeeper, but that role seems insufficient now. I've been helping with the building, learning about the cattle. I'd like to contribute more." Garrett was silent for a long moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "What did you have in mind?" Clara took a deep breath. "I'd like to stay on, if you're agreeable, not just as a housekeeper, but as a partner in building this place." She hurried on before her courage failed her. "I have some money saved from my wages. It's not much, but it could buy a few dairy cows. We could sell butter and cheese in town for additional income." Garrett's expression remained inscrutable. "You're proposing a business arrangement," Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes. I have skills that complement yours. Together we could make this ranch more prosperous than either of us could alone." "And if you were to meet someone, marry?" Garrett asked, his tone still carefully controlled. The question caught Clara off guard. She hadn't allowed herself to think of such possibilities since Joseph's death. "I don't foresee that happening," she said honestly. "But if it did, arrangements could be made for my share to be bought out." Garrett stood and moved to the window, watching the storm rage outside. His silhouette against the occasional lightning flashes seemed solid yet somehow vulnerable. "You should be thinking of a future with a family," he said finally, "not tying yourself to a half-built ranch miles from anywhere." Clara rose as well, frustration building within her. "Shouldn't that be my decision? I've had enough of others determining my path." Garrett turned to face her, his expression troubled. "Clara, you arrived here desperate and with nowhere to go. I can't in good conscience allow you to make decisions now that you might regret when better options become available." His words stung, all the more because they contained an element of truth. She had come to the ranch with no alternatives, grateful for any sanctuary. "I see," she said stiffly. "You still view me as that desperate woman from the saloon, too addled by circumstance to know her own mind." "That's not what Garrett began, but Clara cut him off. "It's exactly what you meant," she said, gathering her dignity around her like armor. "I thank you for your concern, Mr. Donovan, but I assure you I am perfectly capable of determining my own best interests." She left the room before he could respond, retreating to her bedroom and closing the door firmly behind her. Only then did she allow the tears to fall, tears of frustration, disappointment, and a deeper hurt she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The following morning, an uneasy truce settled over the ranch. They worked alongside each other as usual, but the easy companionship of previous weeks had been replaced by careful politeness. Clara focused on her tasks, determined to show no sign of the emotional turmoil she felt. 3 days passed in this fashion before events intervened to disrupt their strained routine. Clara was hanging laundry when she noticed a cloud of dust on the horizon, riders approaching at speed. She dropped the sheet she was holding and ran to alert Garrett, who was repairing a fence near the corral. "Riders coming," she called, pointing toward the dust cloud. "At least 3 moving fast." Garrett squinted against the sun, then nodded grimly. "Get inside, lock the door." This time, Clara didn't argue. She hurried to the house, pausing only to grab the rifle from its place above the door before securing the lock. Through the window, she watched as Garrett positioned himself near the barn, his own revolver visible at his hip. The riders approached rapidly, 4 men on lathered horses, riding hard. Even from a distance, Clara could tell these weren't lawmen. Their unshaven faces and mismatched clothing marked them as the sort of drifters who lived on the margins of frontier society. They reined in sharply before reaching the house, clearly surprised to find someone waiting for them. Garrett stood his ground, one hand resting casually near his revolver. Clara couldn't hear the exchange that followed, but she could see the leader gesticulating angrily while Garrett remained still, his posture alert but not overtly threatening. After several tense minutes, the riders turned their horses and departed, though at a slower pace than they had arrived. Only when they had disappeared over the horizon did Garrett return to the house. Clara unbolted the door, her hands trembling slightly from the ebbing tension. "Who were they?" she asked as he stepped inside. "The stage robbers, most likely," Garrett replied, accepting the cup of water she offered. "Said they were looking for work, but their horses were too fine for ordinary drifters and they were carrying new Winchesters." Clara sank into a chair, the reality of the danger they had faced settling over her. "Why did they leave?" Garrett's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "Told them Sheriff Hayes had been here yesterday with a posse of 6 men, all crack shots. Said they were camped just over the ridge, waiting for word of strangers passing through." "Quick thinking," Clara acknowledged. "But what if they discover you were bluffing?" "They won't be back," Garrett assured her. "Too many easier targets than an alert homestead." "Still, I'll ride to town tomorrow, let Hayes know which direction they were headed." That evening, the strained atmosphere between them had dissipated, replaced by a shared awareness of how quickly circumstances could change on the frontier. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara broke the silence. "I apologize for my outburst the other night," she said. "You've done nothing but help me since I arrived. I had no right to respond with anger." Garrett shook his head. "No need for apologies." "You were right to stand up for yourself." He paused, seemingly gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, Clara." She turned to look at him, surprised by the admission. "The reason I understand about having nowhere to go," he continued, his voice low, "is because I was in that position myself once. After the war, I came back to find my family farm sold for taxes, my parents dead from influenza, and no welcome from neighbors who'd sided with the Confederacy." Clara listened silently, sensing how difficult this revelation was for him. "An old cavalry officer I'd served with offered me a place on his ranch in Wyoming, gave me a chance when I had nothing. That's why I helped you that day in the saloon. I was repaying a debt I could never repay to the man who helped me." "I understand," Clara said softly. "Thank you for telling me." Garrett nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Your proposal about the dairy cows and partnership, it's sound. I just didn't want you to feel obligated to stay out of gratitude or lack of options." "It's not obligation," Clara assured him. "It's choice. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing my own path, not following one laid out by others." Garrett turned to look at her, really look at her, perhaps for the first time. What he saw seemed to satisfy something within him, for he nodded slowly. "Then we have an agreement," he said, extending his hand. Clara took it, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "We do." His hand was warm around hers, strong yet gentle. For a moment, neither moved to break the contact. Then, almost reluctantly, Garrett released her hand and rose to his feet. "Early start tomorrow if I'm riding to town," he said. "Best get some rest." Clara remained on the porch after he'd gone inside, her hand still tingling from his touch. Something had shifted between them, though she couldn't quite define what. All she knew was that for the first time since Joseph's death, She was looking forward to the future with something like hope. The following day, Garrett rode to Silverstone to inform Sheriff Hayes about the suspicious riders. Clara spent the day continuing work on the house, determined to make progress even in his absence. By the time Garrett returned that evening, she had completed the shelving in the new dining area and begun sanding the rough floorboards. "Hayes is gathering men to track those riders," Garrett reported as they sat down to dinner. "Says there have been reports of similar men all through the territory." Clara nodded, passing him a plate of beef stew. "I'm glad you went. I worried they might return." "Brought something back for you," Garrett said, reaching into his pocket. He produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Saw it in the general store and thought you might like it." Surprised, Clara unwrapped the package to find a small bottle of lavender water, a simple luxury she hadn't enjoyed since leaving Pennsylvania. "Garrett, it's lovely," she said, touched by the thoughtful gesture. "Thank you." He shrugged, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude. Place could use some brightening up. The small gift marked another shift in their relationship. In the days that followed, Clara noticed Garrett making other small gestures, bringing wildflowers from the prairie, carving a better handle for her favorite cooking pot, spending evenings teaching her to play checkers instead of immediately retiring to his room. August brought the hottest days of summer, with the prairie baking under a relentless sun. Work on the house slowed as ranch duties demanded more attention. The creek that provided their water began to shrink, forcing Garrett to dig deeper into its bed to ensure the cattle had enough to drink. One particularly scorching afternoon, Clara was working in her garden when she noticed Garrett returning early from checking the herd. He dismounted awkwardly, stumbling slightly as his feet hit the ground. Concerned, Clara set aside her tools and hurried toward him. As she drew closer, she could see his face was flushed, his movements uncharacteristically clumsy. "Are you all right?" she asked, reaching his side. "Just the heat," he mumbled, but Clara could see it was more than that. His skin was hot to the touch, his eyes unfocused. "You're ill," she said firmly, taking his arm. "Come inside, out of the sun." Garrett didn't protest as she guided him toward the house, a sign in itself of how poorly he felt. Inside, Clara helped him to his bed, alarmed by the heat radiating from his body. "Prairie fever, maybe," he said, his voice rough. "Or just sunstroke. I'll be fine after I rest." Clara wasn't convinced. She had seen prairie fever before Joseph had treated cases during his medical training. It could be deadly if not properly managed. "You need to cool down," she said decisively. "I'm going to bring water and wet cloths." Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, Clara tended to Garrett, bathing his face and neck with cool water, encouraging him to drink whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. His fever rose steadily, bringing with it delirium. He murmured incoherently, sometimes addressing people who weren't present, other times speaking of battles long past. By midnight, Clara was terrified. Garrett's fever had spiked dangerously high, his breathing shallow and rapid. She knew that, without medical intervention, he might not survive until morning. The nearest doctor was in Silverstone, a 3-hour ride away. Clara had never made the journey alone, but she saw no alternative. Garrett needed help beyond what she could provide. Making a difficult decision, she prepared to leave. She placed fresh water within Garrett's reach, wrapped him in damp sheets to help lower his temperature, and wrote a note explaining where she had gone in case he regained lucidity in her absence. The thought of riding alone through the night was terrifying, but the prospect of watching Garrett die was infinitely worse. Clara had lost one man she cared for to illness. She was determined not to lose another. Saddling Garrett's most reliable horse was a challenge. The animal was accustomed to his touch. Not hers, but necessity lent her strength and determination. By the time she mounted, the moon had risen, providing just enough light to follow the trail to town. The journey was harrowing. Every shadow seemed to conceal potential dangers: wolves, hostile Indians, or the outlaws who had visited the ranch. Clara kept the horse at a steady pace, faster than was comfortable for her limited riding experience, but slower than her anxiety demanded. Silverstone was quiet when she arrived, most buildings dark except for the saloon. Clara rode directly to the doctor's house, a small building behind the general store. She pounded on the door until a disheveled man appeared, blinking in the lantern light. "Mr. Donovan is desperately ill with fever," she explained breathlessly. "Please, you must come." Dr. Wilson, a gruff man in his 50s, asked several pointed questions about Garrett's symptoms before nodding grimly. "Could be several things, none good. Let me gather my supplies." While the doctor prepared, Clara roused the livery stable owner to secure a fresh horse for her return journey. The man was reluctant to provide a mount until she explained the emergency, at which point he not only saddled his fastest horse, but insisted on accompanying them back to the ranch. "Donovan's a good man," he said simply, "done me a few favors over the years." By the time they returned to the ranch, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. Clara led the doctor directly to Garrett's room, her heart in her throat as she wondered what they would find. To her immense relief, Garrett was still breathing, though his condition had worsened during her absence. His skin was gray beneath the flush of fever, his breathing labored. Dr. Wilson set to work immediately, examining his patient with practiced efficiency. After a thorough assessment, he turned to Clara. "It's tick fever," he announced. "Nasty, but treatable if caught in time. We need to get his temperature down and keep him hydrated." For the next 3 days, Clara barely left Garrett's bedside. She followed the doctor's instructions meticulously, administering the bitter medicines he provided, changing cool compresses, and coaxing broth between Garrett's parched lips whenever possible. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Clara, dozing in a chair beside the bed, woke to find Garrett watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "You're still here," he said, his voice weak but lucid. Relief washed over Clara in a dizzying wave. "Of course I am," she replied, moving to check his temperature with the back of her hand. "Where else would I be?" Garrett caught her wrist gently. "You rode to town alone at night." Clara nodded, suddenly self-conscious under his intense gaze. "You needed a doctor." "You could have been killed," he said, his voice strengthening with emotion. "Outlaws, wolves, a dozen other dangers, and you could have died," Clara interrupted. "I made the only choice I could live with." Garrett fell silent, still holding her wrist, his thumb unconsciously tracing small circles against her pulse point. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through Clara's body that had nothing to do with fever. "Thank you," he finally said, releasing her wrist, "for saving my life." Clara busied herself pouring fresh water, her cheeks flushed. "The doctor did the saving, I just fetched him." "No," Garrett insisted. "It was you. Recovery was slow, doctor." Wilson had warned that tick fever left its victims weakened for weeks afterward, and Garrett chafed at the enforced inactivity. Clara found herself in the unfamiliar position of insisting he rest while she took on additional ranch responsibilities. "The cattle can survive another day without your personal attention," she informed him when he attempted to saddle his horse less than a week after the fever broke. "Mr. Taylor from the livery stable has been checking them daily, as you well know." Garrett scowled but returned to the house, too weak to argue effectively. Clara hid her smile until she was out of sight, amused by this glimpse of the stubborn man beneath the usually stoic exterior. As August gave way to September, Garrett gradually resumed his duties, though Clara noticed he tired more easily than before his illness. She found subtle ways to lighten his workload, having meals prepared earlier so he could rest longer at midday, taking on tasks she knew would strain his recovering strength. Work on the house resumed as well, though at a more measured pace. The first-floor addition was nearly complete, with only finishing touches remaining. Clara had begun braiding rag rugs for the new rooms, working in the evenings while Garrett whittled or read aloud from one of the few books they possessed. These quiet evenings fostered a growing intimacy between them. Without discussing it, they had begun to build a life together, not as employer and employee, or even as business partners, but as two people who had found in each other something worth preserving. One evening in mid-September, as the first hints of autumn crispness touched the air, Garrett brought up a subject they had tacitly avoided since his recovery. "About the dairy cows you suggested," he said as they sat before the fire. "I think it's a good idea. We could start with 2, maybe 3 if the price is right." Clara looked up from her rug braiding, surprised by the sudden return to their business discussion. "Are you certain it would require an investment?" Garrett nodded. "I've been thinking about it while I was laid up. This place needs to be more than just cattle if it's going to thrive. Diversity is security out here." Clara set aside her work, excitement building within her. "I could make cheese my grandmother taught me how, and butter sells well in town, especially in winter when fresh milk is scarce." They spent the evening planning, their earlier enthusiasm rekindled. Clara sketched designs for a milk house while Garrett calculated costs and potential profits. By the time they retired for the night, they had outlined a plan to implement in the spring. "Good night, Clara," Garrett said as they parted at their respective doors. "I'm glad you're here." The simple statement carried a weight that made Clara's heart beat faster. "So am I," she replied softly. The following week brought unexpected visitors. Clara was kneading bread when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Looking out the window, she was surprised to see a family, a man, woman, and 3 children making their way toward the house. Garrett emerged from the barn to greet them, and Clara watched as he exchanged handshakes with the man. After a brief conversation, he led the group toward the house. "Clara," he called as they approached the porch, "come meet our new neighbors." The family was introduced as the Petersons, Thomas, Mary, and their children Emma, John, and baby Daniel. They had recently claimed land 5 miles to the east and were making courtesy calls to establish relations with nearby homesteaders. "We're mighty pleased to meet another woman," Mary Peterson said warmly as Clara served coffee. "It gets lonesome with just the children for company most days." Clara smiled in understanding. "I know the feeling well. Please visit whenever you like." The women fell into easy conversation while Garrett and Thomas discussed water sources and grazing land. The older Peterson children explored the ranch with wide-eyed curiosity, clearly excited by the change of scenery. "Your husband's built a fine place here," Mary commented, bouncing baby Daniel on her knee. "How long have you been married?" The question caught Clara off guard. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't require a lengthy explanation, Garrett answered from across the room. "Clara and I aren't married," he said simply. "We're partners in this ranch." Thomas Peterson looked confused. "Partners, but you live together." "It's an unusual arrangement," Clara acknowledged, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks, "but it works for us." Mary looked between them, a knowing expression crossing her face. "Well, arrangements have a way of evolving out here, don't they?" she said diplomatically. "The important thing is you're making this land yield a living." The Petersons stayed for dinner, and Clara found herself enjoying the company immensely. Mary was practical and good-humored, with a wealth of knowledge about frontier housekeeping that she freely shared. The children brought a liveliness to the ranch house that Clara hadn't realized she missed. After their guests departed with promises of return invitations, Clara and Garrett stood on the porch watching the wagon disappear into the gathering twilight. "They seem like good people," Garrett observed. "Having neighbors could be useful come winter." Clara nodded, thinking of Mary's easy assumption that they were married. "It was nice, wasn't it, having a family filling the house with noise and life?" Garrett glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "It was," he agreed quietly. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself thinking often of Mary Peterson's words, arrangements evolving. It was true that her relationship with Garrett had transformed since that first day in the saloon from desperate stranger to housekeeper to partner. But lately, she had begun to wonder if it might evolve yet further. She caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the quiet competence with which he approached every task. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was amused, though full smiles remained rare. She found excuses to be near him, to engage him in conversation, to learn more about the man who had offered her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't aware, she caught him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. October brought the first frost, silver white on the prairie grass in the early mornings. The house addition was complete enough to use, though some finishing work remained for the winter months. Clara had moved her bedroom to the new upper floor, giving her more space and privacy than the small room she had first occupied. The ranch was preparing for winter. Garrett spent long days cutting and stacking firewood, repairing any weaknesses in the barn and corral, and ensuring the cattle had access to sheltered areas for the coming harsh weather. Clara preserved the last of her garden's bounty, storing root vegetables in the newly dug root cellar and drying herbs to hang from the kitchen rafters. One evening, as the first snow flurries danced in the air, they sat before the fire discussing plans for the following spring. The conversation turned to the future, to what the ranch might become with time and continued effort. "We should have a proper orchard," Clara suggested. "Apple trees would do well on that south-facing slope near the creek." "Takes years for apple trees to bear fruit," Garrett pointed out. "Yes," Clara agreed, "but that's how you build something lasting, by planning beyond the immediate season." Garrett studied her for a long moment. "You're thinking of staying that long? Years?" Clara met his gaze steadily. "I am, unless you'd prefer I didn't." "No," he said quickly. "That is, yes, I mean I want you to stay." He ran a hand through his hair, uncharacteristically flustered. "What I'm trying to say, poorly, is that I hope you'll stay, permanently." Clara's heart quickened. "As your business partner." Garrett set aside the piece of wood he'd been whittling and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Clara," he began, then paused, seeming to gather his courage. "When you rode out alone that night to fetch the doctor, I was delirious with fever. But I remember one thing clearly, the moment I realized I might die without telling you what you've come to mean to me." Clara's hands trembled in her lap. "And what is that?" "Everything," he said simply. "You've become everything to me, not just a partner in this ranch, but a partner in life. I love you, Clara. I think I have since that first day when you stood in the saloon, chin up despite your circumstances, determined to find your way." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. "Garrett, let me finish," he said gently. "I know I'm not what you expected when you came west. I'm not educated like your fiancé was. This life is hard, and I can't offer you the comforts you probably grew up with, but I can promise to build alongside you, to cherish you, to create a home and a life that's ours together." He took her hands in his. "I built this house for you, Clara. From the moment you said you had nowhere to go, I knew I wanted to create a place where you would always belong." Clara's tears spilled over, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for months, though I was afraid to admit it even to myself." Garrett's face transformed with a smile more radiant than any she had yet seen from him. Gently, he drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of longing finally fulfilled. When they parted, Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Well," Garrett said, his voice rumbling beneath her ear, "I suppose the proper thing would be for me to ask you to marry me." Clara lifted her head to look into his eyes. "And is that what you want, more than anything?" he replied. "Clara Zimmerman, will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner in everything?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." The following week, they rode to Silverstone together. The small church at the edge of town witnessed their simple ceremony with Sheriff Hayes and Dr. Wilson serving as witnesses. Mary Peterson had insisted on baking a wedding cake, which they shared with the handful of townsfolk who attended the impromptu celebration at the saloon afterward. As they rode home in the wagon, now husband and wife, Clara looked out over the prairie that had become her home. Snow was beginning to dust the landscape, transforming the familiar terrain into something magical. "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about that day in the saloon," she replied. "How desperate I was, how lost. I told you I had nowhere to go, and you built me a house from the ground up." Garrett squeezed her hand. "Built us a home," he corrected gently, "and we're not finished building yet." Clara smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "No," she agreed. "We're just beginning." As the wagon crested the final hill, their ranch came into view, the house with its new addition, smoke curling from the chimney, the barn and corral standing sturdy against the approaching winter. It wasn't grand or imposing, but it was theirs, created through shared labor and vision. Clara thought of the long winter ahead, of evenings by the fire, of waking each morning beside the man she loved. She thought of spring and the dairy cows they would purchase and the apple trees they would plant on the south-facing slope. She thought of the children they might have someday, running through rooms built by their father's hands. "Home," she said softly as Garrett helped her down from the wagon. "Our home." He gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise in the falling snow. "Forever," he whispered against her lips, and Clara knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. 20 years later, the ranch had grown beyond what either of them could have imagined that snowy wedding day. The original house had expanded again to accommodate their growing family, 3 children who had brought immeasurable joy to their lives. The dairy operation Clara had envisioned had flourished, with cheese from Donovan Ranch now sought after throughout the territory. The apple orchard on the south slope produced bountiful harvests each autumn. On their 20th anniversary, Clara and Garrett stood on the porch of the house he had built for her, watching their children and grandchildren playing in the yard. Their eldest daughter, Sarah, had married a local boy and built her own home just over the hill. Their son, Michael, worked the ranch alongside his father, learning the business he would someday inherit. Their youngest, Emily, still lived at home but talked of becoming a teacher in the school that had been established in what was now a proper town rather than a mere trading post. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked, leaning against Garrett's shoulder. His hair was now streaked with silver, his face more lined, but his eyes still held the same steady warmth that had first drawn her to him. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted, his arm tightening around her waist. "I was just hoping to convince a beautiful woman to take a chance on a lonely cowboy with a half-built house." Clara laughed, the sound as clear and joyful as it had been in her youth. "Best decision I ever made," she said, turning to face the man who had built her not just a house, but a life filled with love. Garrett leaned down to kiss her, just as the setting sun painted the prairie in gold, much as it had the day she first saw what would become her forever home. "Mine too," he whispered. "Without a doubt, mine too."